Imagine an entire town disappearing overnight. No bodies, no bones, no ash from a fire, no wreckage, no sign of a struggle. Just empty houses, standing quiet under an open sky. This isn't fiction. In 1590, a rescue ship sailed toward the shores of North America, searching for over 100 missing men, women, and children. What the crew found waiting for them would haunt historians for more than 400 years. Because the colony wasn't destroyed, it wasn't burned, it was simply gone. As if the earth itself had opened its mouth and swallowed every living soul without leaving a single scream behind. The place was called Roanoke. Today, most Americans know the name only vaguely, a half-remembered fragment from a history class. But in the late 16th century, Roanoke was the boldest gamble in England's entire colonial ambition, a fragile foothold on a continent that swallowed ships, men, and entire expeditions without mercy. And what happened to the people who lived there still cannot be fully explained. Not by historians, not by archaeologists, not by the descendants of the indigenous nations who once called this coastline home. The only clue left behind was a single carved word, and that word only deepened the mystery.
To understand how anyone could vanish so completely, we have to go back further, to a moment when England was a second-rate power staring jealously across the Atlantic at Spain's glittering empire of gold. This is not the story of a nation confidently building an empire. It is the story of a desperate, underfunded gamble, driven by ambition, arrogance, and the restless dreams of one man who never once set foot on the land he claimed. His name was Walter Raleigh, and his obsession with the New World would set in motion a chain of decisions that ended in silence.
By the 1580s, Spain controlled vast stretches of the Americas, extracting silver from Peru and gold from Mexico at a scale that terrified the rest of Europe. Queen Elizabeth I watched her rivals grow richer, while England remained a modest island kingdom, constantly threatened by invasion. Raleigh convinced her that England needed its own foothold across the ocean, a base from which privateers could strike Spanish treasure fleets, and from which English settlers could plant a permanent claim. It was a plan built on greed, patriotism, and pure fantasy about what awaited them across 3,000 miles of open water. Raleigh never crossed the Atlantic himself. Instead, he sent others to do the dying. In 1584, he dispatched 2 ships to scout the coastline of what is now North Carolina. The explorers returned describing a paradise, forests thick with game, rivers overflowing with fish, and indigenous peoples who greeted them with what seemed like open curiosity. Queen Elizabeth was delighted. She granted the region a name meant to flatter her own unmarried status, Virginia, in honor of the so-called Virgin Queen. No one yet understood that this paradise would become one of the most confounding graveyards of unanswered questions in American history. The first real attempt at settlement came in 1585, a military expedition of over 100 soldiers and planners, not families. They built a fort on Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land tucked behind North Carolina's Outer Banks. Almost immediately, things went wrong. Supplies ran low. Relations with the local Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Secatan and Roanoke tribes, curdled from cautious cooperation into open hostility. English soldiers, arrogant and desperate, executed a respected indigenous leader named Wingina over suspected conspiracy. Trust, once broken, could never be rebuilt. Within a year, the surviving colonists begged passing English ships to carry them home.
That first colony's failure should have been a warning. Instead, Raleigh saw only a problem of planning, not of judgment. He believed the mistake had been sending soldiers instead of settlers, men without any real stake in building a life on foreign soil. His solution was to try again, this time with something far more permanent and far more human: families. Men, women, and children who intended not to plunder, but to stay. In 1587, a new expedition prepared to sail, led by an artist and mapmaker named John White, a man whose fate would become inseparable from the mystery that followed. John White was not a soldier or a nobleman chasing gold. He was an observer, a painter who had documented the first expedition's encounters with indigenous life in extraordinary, delicate watercolor detail. He understood, better than most Englishmen of his era, that survival in this new world depended on diplomacy, not domination. White carried with him not just settlers, but his own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband. This was deeply personal. White wasn't simply governing a colony, he was building a home for his own bloodline, an act of faith in a land that had already proven it could turn deadly without warning. In July of 1587, 115 men, women, and children stepped onto the shores of Roanoke Island, expecting to find the 15 soldiers White's predecessor had left behind to hold the fort. Instead, they found only a single skeleton and a settlement reclaimed by weeds and wildlife. The other men had vanished. No explanation, no warning, just silence and overgrown grass where English buildings once stood. It should have been a chilling omen, but the new colonists had crossed an ocean, and there was no turning back now. They began, uneasily, to rebuild what had already once been abandoned. Within weeks, the fragile peace with neighboring indigenous communities collapsed entirely. One colonist, George Howe, wandered alone to gather crabs and was killed, struck down by warriors from a tribe still furious over the previous colony's violence. Fear rippled through the settlement. These English families were not soldiers. They were carpenters, farmers, and mothers, utterly unprepared for a conflict they hadn't started, but had inherited. And yet, in the middle of this mounting terror, something extraordinary happened, something that would forever tie this colony to a name still spoken today in classrooms across America: the birth of a child. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor White Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia, the first English child ever born on American soil. For a brief, fragile moment, joy broke through the growing dread. Imagine the scene: a newborn's cry inside a wooden structure, surrounded by unfamiliar forest. Her grandfather, John White, holding her, aware that her survival now depended entirely on decisions he alone would have to make. This child, barely a week old, was already the symbol of England's entire experiment in the New World. And her fate, more than anyone else's, is the true unsolved heart of this story. The colonists quickly realized they lacked the supplies to survive a full year on Roanoke. Winter was coming, tensions with local tribes had turned lethal, and the ships that brought them had already turned back toward England. Someone needed to sail home immediately to secure reinforcements and provisions before the situation became unsurvivable. The colonists begged John White to be that person. He was, after all, their governor, their most experienced negotiator, and the man with the closest ties to Raleigh's financial backers in London. But this meant leaving behind everyone he loved, including a granddaughter barely 1 month old. White resisted at first. Leaving now felt like abandonment. But the colonists convinced him that no one else carried the authority or the relationships needed to secure their survival. Reluctantly, he agreed, believing he would be back within months. Before departing, White and the colonists made a plan, a code meant to communicate danger across the silence of an ocean crossing. If the colonists were forced to relocate, they would carve their destination into a tree or post, and if they were leaving because of an attack, they would carve a Maltese cross above it, a desperate signal meant to say, "We were taken by force." In late August of 1587, John White boarded a ship and sailed away from Roanoke, staring back at a shrinking coastline where his daughter, son-in-law, and infant granddaughter remained. He fully expected to return before the year's end. He could not have imagined that history itself was about to conspire against him,
trapping him an ocean away for nearly 3 full years. What awaited England was not a quiet return voyage home, but an international crisis so massive it would consume every ship, every sailor, and every resource the Crown possessed, leaving Roanoke's fate entirely, terrifyingly out of anyone's hands. White reached England in November of 1587, expecting to quickly assemble a resupply fleet. Instead, he arrived into a nation bracing for war. Spain, furious over years of English piracy against its treasure ships, was building the largest naval invasion force Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth issued an emergency order forbidding any ship from leaving English ports, no matter its purpose. Every vessel, every able sailor was needed for national survival. White's small resupply mission, carrying food and reinforcements for 115 civilians across the ocean, suddenly meant nothing next to the looming threat of invasion. White pleaded, argued, and petitioned everyone he could reach, describing his desperate, isolated colonists, including his own infant granddaughter, waiting for supplies that might never come. In April of 1588, he finally managed to secure 2 small vessels, far smaller than intended, but something. It should have been enough to reach Roanoke and return with news. Instead, the greed of his own crew doomed the voyage before it truly began. Rather than sailing directly to America, the sailors diverted to hunt for Spanish prize ships along the way, hoping for plunder. It was a decision that would cost everyone dearly. The gamble failed catastrophically. White's ships encountered a French privateer vessel and were violently attacked, leaving the English crews battered, wounded, and stripped of supplies. Unable to continue, both ships limped back to England in defeat. White had failed to reach Roanoke a second time, and now, with the Spanish Armada bearing down on England's very shores, there would be no third attempt for years. Somewhere across the Atlantic, more than 100 English colonists, including a newborn girl not yet 1 year old, waited for a rescue that had already failed twice, without any way of knowing why. The Spanish Armada finally sailed against England in the summer of 1588, in one of the most consequential naval campaigns in European history. England's ultimate victory, aided by fierce storms and skilled seamanship, saved the nation from invasion, but it devastated the very resources White needed for a return voyage. Ships were destroyed, sailors died. National funds that might have supported Roanoke were consumed entirely by war. For the colonists left behind, none of this mattered, and none of it was visible. All they knew was that their governor had promised to return, and month after month, the horizon remained achingly, permanently empty. For nearly 3 years, John White fought a war of his own, not against Spain, but against indifference, bureaucracy, and a colonial investment that no longer excited England's wealthy backers. Roanoke had become a financial burden rather than a triumph. Raleigh, distracted by other ventures, eventually transferred rights to the colony to a group of merchants more interested in trade profits than in rescuing settlers. White, a grandfather desperate for any ship willing to sail, found himself begging investors for a voyage they viewed as a low priority. Every delay meant another season his family endured alone, facing dangers he could only imagine from thousands of miles away. Finally, in March of 1590, White secured passage on a privateering expedition heading toward the Caribbean, with a promise that the ships would detour to Roanoke afterward. It wasn't the rescue mission he had dreamed of. It was an afterthought, squeezed into someone else's profitable voyage. Still, it was something. After nearly 3 years of failure, frustration, and mounting dread, White finally set sail across the Atlantic once more, praying that his daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter, along with everyone else he had left behind, were still alive, waiting patiently on that same narrow strip of coastline where he had last seen them. The voyage itself tested White's endurance in ways he could never have prepared for. The privateering fleet spent months raiding Spanish shipping across the Caribbean, delaying the journey to Roanoke even further. By the time the ships finally turned north toward the Carolina coast, it was August of 1590, almost exactly 3 years since White had left. As the familiar outline of the Outer Banks appeared on the horizon, White must have felt an overwhelming mixture of hope and dread. 3 years of silence were about to end, one way or another. But nature itself seemed determined to make even this final approach unbearably difficult.
Violent storms battered the coastline as the ships attempted to navigate the dangerous, shifting sandbars surrounding Roanoke. One landing boat capsized in the surf, killing several sailors instantly in the churning waves, a horrifying reminder of how unforgiving this coastline had always been. Despite the tragedy, White refused to turn back. He had waited 3 unbearable years for this moment. On August 18th, 1590, by pure and almost unbearable coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day since his granddaughter Virginia Dare had been born, John White finally set foot again on Roanoke Island, walking toward the settlement where his family had waited. As White and his search party approached the location where the colony once stood, an eerie stillness surrounded them. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices called out in greeting, no children ran to meet the returning ships. Instead, the settlement stood abandoned, its wooden palisade fence still standing, but the buildings inside stripped bare. It looked less like a scene of violence and more like a place that had been deliberately, methodically packed up and left behind. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't happened suddenly. Someone had made choices, calm and deliberate ones, before disappearing entirely from human record. White searched desperately for any sign of struggle. Blood, broken weapons, scattered belongings, anything indicating an attack. He found almost nothing. Heavy iron objects, cannons, and other equipment too cumbersome to carry had been buried carefully in pits, as though the colonists intended to return for them someday. Chests belonging to White himself, which he had left behind for safekeeping, had been dug up and ransacked, their contents scattered and damaged, apparently by scavengers rather than attackers. It was a scene that made no immediate sense, too orderly for a massacre, too abandoned for a peaceful departure, too silent for any easy explanation. Then White noticed it. Carved deliberately into a wooden post at the entrance to the settlement, in clear, deliberate capital letters, were the letters CRO. Nearby, carved even more prominently into one of the fort's support posts, was a complete word, CROATOAN. It was the name of a nearby island and of the indigenous people who lived there, allies the colonists had maintained friendly relations with. It was, according to the code White himself had helped establish 3 years earlier, exactly the kind of message meant to indicate a planned, peaceful relocation, and crucially, there was no Maltese cross carved anywhere nearby. That missing cross should have meant everything. According to the plan White and the colonists had agreed upon before his departure, the absence of a cross meant the move to CROATOAN hadn't been made under attack or duress. It suggested, as clearly as any message carved in wood could suggest, that his family and neighbors had left willingly, likely to live among the CROATOAN people for safety, food, or shelter while awaiting his return. For a brief moment, hope must have surged through White's exhausted body. His family might be alive, only 50 miles south, waiting on CROATOAN Island. All he needed to do was sail there. But the same storm system that had already killed several sailors during the landing had not finished with White's expedition. As the ships prepared to sail toward CROATOAN Island to search for the colonists, the weather turned violently against them once again. Anchor cables snapped in the churning seas. One ship was nearly wrecked entirely along the shifting, dangerous sandbars of the Outer Banks. The fleet's captain, weighing the safety of his remaining crew against the uncertain search for over 100 missing colonists, made the devastating decision to abandon the search and sail for the Caribbean to wait out the season. White begged, argued and pleaded for the search to continue. He had waited 3 years, crossed an ocean twice, and now stood mere miles from what might be his family's location, only to be turned away by wind and tide. But he had no authority over the ship's captain, who commanded a privateering vessel with its own commercial priorities entirely separate from White's personal mission. The fleet turned south, promising to attempt the search again the following spring. John White, a grandfather who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean twice searching for his family, was forced to sail away from Roanoke without ever setting foot on CROATOAN Island. That promised return the following spring never happened. White's fortunes, resources, and connections had been exhausted by years of failed voyages, war, and financial disappointment. He eventually retired to Ireland, writing anguished letters describing his desperate, unfulfilled hope that his daughter and granddaughter still lived. In one surviving letter, he described his colonists' fate as something he had committed entirely into the hands of God, having exhausted every human means available to him. He died sometime after 1593, having never learned whether Eleanor, Ananias, or baby Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, had survived even a single additional day beyond that final August afternoon. And so the mystery calcified into legend, unresolved for over 4 centuries. What actually happened to the more than 100 men, women, and children of the Roanoke colony? Did they truly relocate peacefully to CROATOAN Island, absorbed gradually into indigenous communities through marriage, trade, and shared survival? Did disease, starvation, or a violent conflict with a different, less friendly tribe wipe them out entirely? Were they captured, enslaved, or killed by Spanish forces patrolling the coastline for rival European settlements? Every generation of historians has proposed new answers, and every generation has ultimately confronted the same maddening wall of missing evidence. The most widely supported theory among modern historians centers on that carved word, CROATOAN. Located on what is now Hatteras Island, the CROATOAN people maintained a documented, friendly relationship with the English colonists throughout their brief occupation. Their leader, Manteo, had even traveled to England himself and returned as an ally and interpreter. If the Roanoke colonists faced starvation or hostility from other tribes, moving in with established CROATOAN allies would have been the most logical, survivable decision imaginable. Rather than a tragic disappearance, this theory suggests something quieter and more human: assimilation, intermarriage, and the slow, deliberate blending of 2 struggling peoples into one shared community. Remarkably, this theory gained startling support centuries later. In 1701, an English explorer named John Lawson visited Hatteras Island and documented something extraordinary. Among the indigenous people living there, he encountered individuals with gray eyes, a physical trait uncommon among indigenous populations, but common among Europeans. Local oral tradition, as Lawson recorded it, spoke of ancestors who could talk in a book, an apparent reference to reading and writing, alongside stories of white ancestors. It was, more than a century after the colonists vanished, a haunting suggestion that their bloodline and perhaps their culture had never truly disappeared at all. Modern archaeology has added new, tantalizing layers to this theory without ever providing definitive proof. Excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered English artifacts, including a signet ring, gun parts, and fragments of European-style pottery dating to the correct period and found alongside indigenous tools and materials. This mixing of English and native artifacts in the same archaeological layers suggests genuine, sustained contact and cohabitation, not merely a brief visit. It doesn't prove every colonist survived, but it strongly suggests that at least some of them did exactly what that carved word implied. They walked south, and they were welcomed. Yet not every clue points toward a peaceful ending. In 2012, researchers studying one of John White's own hand-drawn maps of the Roanoke region discovered something hidden beneath a small patch, a corrected mistake covering an even earlier mark. Beneath modern imaging technology, a faint symbol emerged, what appeared to be a fort location roughly 50 miles inland near the confluence of two rivers. This location, now called Site X, suggested the colonists may have planned or even executed an inland relocation entirely separate from CROATOAN Island, a second possible destination that further scatters the mystery across an even wider, more confusing map. Archaeological excavations at Site X, conducted by the First Colony Foundation beginning in 2012, have indeed uncovered English pottery fragments and other period-accurate artifacts at this inland location. Some researchers believe this represents where a portion of the colonies relocated, perhaps splitting into smaller groups to increase their odds of survival by spreading dependence on indigenous hospitality across multiple communities rather than overwhelming a single host tribe. If true, the Roanoke colonists didn't vanish as one unified group with one unified fate. They may have fractured, some heading toward CROATOAN in the south, others moving inland, their stories diverging into separate, equally unrecorded endings. Other historians point toward a far darker possibility. Not every neighboring tribe viewed the English with the same tolerance as the CROATOAN people. Powhatan, the powerful chief who would later encounter the Jamestown colonists in 1607, ruled a large confederacy of tribes across the Chesapeake Bay region. Captain John Smith, writing years later, recorded second-hand accounts suggesting Powhatan's forces had attacked and killed a group of English settlers matching Roanoke's description, wiping them out shortly before Jamestown's founding because a prophecy had warned that a nation would rise from the coastline and destroy his people. If accurate, this account transforms hope into tragedy. This theory carries a particularly chilling weight because of who reported it. Powhatan's own daughter, later known to history as Pocahontas, allegedly relayed fragments of this story to English colonists at Jamestown. Some accounts suggest Powhatan even displayed brass objects and other English artifacts, implying they had been taken as spoils following an attack on surviving Roanoke colonists who had been living among a smaller tribe near the Chesapeake. If true, this would mean the colonists survived for nearly 2 decades after John White's departure, only to be violently eliminated just before a new wave of English settlers finally succeeded in establishing a permanent foothold. Disease presents another sobering, if less dramatic, possibility. European settlers, despite believing themselves civilized and prepared, frequently succumbed to unfamiliar illnesses, malnutrition, and the sheer brutality of an unforgiving environment they didn't understand. Colonial records from other early settlements describe colonists dying from dysentery, malaria-like fevers, and severe malnutrition within their very first year. Even without any conflict at all, more than 100 people, including infants and the elderly, may have simply been unable to survive the physical demands of an unforgiving coastline. Their bodies eventually lost to decomposition, scavenging animals, and the relentless reclamation of nature itself. Climate science has recently added a startling new piece to this puzzle. Researchers analyzing tree ring data from ancient cypress trees in the region discovered that the years surrounding 1587 coincided with the worst drought to strike the area in nearly 800 years. This wasn't simply bad luck. It was an environmental catastrophe. Crops that colonists and indigenous communities alike depended on for survival would have failed dramatically, creating desperate competition for increasingly scarce food resources. A drought this severe doesn't just explain hunger, it explains why tensions between English settlers and indigenous nations, already strained, may have escalated toward open, resource-driven conflict. Spain, too, cannot be entirely ruled out. Spanish forces, based in Florida, actively patrolled the Atlantic coastline, searching for exactly this kind of unauthorized English settlement, viewing any foreign colony as a direct threat to their claimed territory. Spanish scouting expeditions are documented as having searched for Roanoke specifically, though surviving records suggest they arrived too late, finding the settlement already abandoned rather than launching an attack themselves. Still, some historians argue that undocumented Spanish raids,
conducted quietly to avoid provoking open war with England, remain entirely plausible, especially given Spain's demonstrated willingness to violently eliminate rival European settlements elsewhere along the American coastline.
Perhaps the most human explanation, though, requires no conspiracy, no massacre, and no singular dramatic event at all. Consider the colonists' actual situation in 1587. Isolated, underfed, facing a brutal historic drought, surrounded by tribes whose trust England had already violated through earlier violence, and receiving no promised resupply for 3 consecutive years. Faced with slow starvation on Roanoke Island, the rational, survivable choice wasn't waiting endlessly for a governor who might never return. It was walking toward people who had already shown them kindness. Not a mystery requiring dramatic revelation, but a quiet, desperate act of human survival, deliberately choosing life among strangers over certain death among ruins. This theory finds unexpected, modern support in an unlikely place: genetics. Beginning in the early 2000s, the Lost Colony DNA Project began collecting genetic samples from families along the North Carolina coast whose oral traditions claim descent from the Roanoke colonists. While no result has provided absolute courtroom-level proof, researchers have identified genetic markers among some indigenous and mixed heritage families in the region that are consistent with European ancestry dating to roughly the correct historical period. Science, slowly and imperfectly, appears to be confirming what that carved word CROATOAN suggested over 4 centuries earlier. At least some of the colonists survived, and their descendants may be alive today. Not every piece of supposed evidence, however, has withstood scrutiny. In the 1930s, a series of stones bearing supposed messages from Eleanor Dare herself began surfacing across Georgia and North Carolina, describing, in dramatic detail, the colonists' deaths at the hands of hostile natives. Initially celebrated by historians as a monumental discovery, the so-called Dare stones were later exposed as an elaborate hoax, likely fabricated for profit during the Great Depression. This episode serves as a sobering reminder. The Roanoke mystery's emotional power has made it a magnet for fraud, exploitation, and wishful thinking, forcing serious historians to separate genuine archaeological evidence from centuries of convenient fabrication. So why, after more than 400 years of investigation, does this mystery remain unsolved? Partly, it's a problem of physical evidence. Roanoke Island's coastline has eroded dramatically since the 16th century, meaning parts of the original settlement, and any artifacts they contained, may now lie permanently underwater or destroyed by shifting sand. Written records from the period are frustratingly sparse, filtered entirely through English perspectives that rarely bother documenting indigenous accounts with any accuracy or respect. And indigenous oral histories, passed down for generations without written preservation, were often dismissed by later European historians as unreliable folklore, rather than genuine, credible historical testimony worth serious investigation. Modern researchers continue searching, using tools John White could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, and advanced archaeological dating techniques have all been deployed across Roanoke Island, Hatteras Island, and Site X in recent decades. Each new excavation season brings fresh fragments of pottery, metal, and bone, small pieces of an enormous, scattered puzzle. Yet no single discovery has definitively closed the case. Perhaps that's fitting. The Roanoke colonists themselves lived at the fragile edge between 2 worlds, English ambition and indigenous survival, and their disappearance remains suspended at that same fragile edge, refusing to resolve neatly into a single satisfying explanation. What we do know with certainty is this. On an August afternoon in 1590, John White stood alone at the edge of an empty settlement, staring at a single carved word that offered hope without ever delivering certainty. He never learned his granddaughter's fate. He never confirmed whether his daughter lived a long life among the CROATOAN people or died within months of his departure. He carried that unbearable uncertainty for the rest of his own life. A grandfather forever suspended between hope and grief, unable to close the door on either possibility. In many ways, that uncertainty is exactly what still defines this mystery today. Virginia Dare herself became something larger than a single missing infant. Over the following centuries, she transformed into a powerful American symbol, representing innocence, resilience, and the fragile, uncertain birth of a nation built on a foundation of both hope and loss. Statues, place names, and even a species of grape now carry her name across North Carolina and beyond. She never had the chance to grow up, to speak a single recorded word, or to leave behind any account of her own experience. Yet she remains, even now, one of the most enduring symbols of America's earliest, most uncertain beginnings. A child who became a legend precisely because she disappeared. The Roanoke mystery also forces us to confront an uncomfortable historical truth. English colonization was never the tidy, triumphant story often told in textbooks. It was chaotic, poorly planned, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of indigenous nations that England's own soldiers had repeatedly betrayed. The colonists who vanished from Roanoke weren't simply victims of an unsolvable mystery. They were ordinary people trapped between an empire that abandoned them and a continent that had every reason to distrust them. Their disappearance isn't just a ghost story, it's a mirror reflecting the genuine desperation, dependency, and moral complexity buried beneath America's earliest colonial ambitions. Today, visitors to Roanoke Island can walk the reconstructed earthworks of the original fort, stand near the spot where that fateful word was carved, and look out across the same restless, storm-prone waters that once separated John White from everyone he loved. Archaeological teams continue their patient, painstaking work each summer, searching for the fragment of pottery, the trace of bone, or the buried post that might finally, definitively answer a question that has echoed across 4 centuries. Every dig season, researchers hold on to the same fragile hope White himself carried home from that empty settlement, that somewhere the truth is still waiting to be found. Perhaps the deepest truth about Roanoke isn't found in any single theory, but in what its unresolved silence reveals about us. We are a species desperate for endings, uncomfortable with permanent uncertainty, forever searching for the one clue that will finally close an open wound. But some stories refuse that comfort. The Roanoke colonists remind us that history isn't always a tidy narrative with a satisfying conclusion. Sometimes it's a single word carved into wood, a question passed down through centuries, and a grandfather standing alone on an empty shore, forever waiting for an answer that America, even now, has never fully been able to give him. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.